The morning of my 70th birthday did not begin with a phone call or the joyous chime of a text message. It began with the silence I had spent a decade trying to ignore, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the floral wallpaper of my bedroom. I woke before the sun had even begun to fold the knitted afghan at the foot of my bed. My bones ached with the familiar rhythm of 70 years, but my heart held a quiet, foolish anticipation. It was October 14th. In my mind, this was the day the silence would finally break. I walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath my slippers. The ritual began, as it always did, with the kettle. It clicked once, a sharp metallic snap in the stillness, before it sighed to life, sending a plume of steam into the dim morning light. Outside, the world was turning to amber. The old oak trees lining the driveway were shedding their leaves, sending them dancing across the gravel like discarded golden tissue paper. It was beautiful, but it was a lonely beauty. By 7, I was at the farmer's market. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. Mr. Doyle was there, standing behind a mountain of Macintosh apples. He looked exactly as he had for 20 years, flannel shirt tucked sloppily into his jeans, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. When he saw me, he didn't just wave. He reached for a bundle of fresh rosemary and held it out. "On the house, Marion," he said, his voice a gravelly comfort. "For that roast you do, the one you only make when the whole family's coming home." I smiled. I practiced that smile in the reflection of my toaster every morning, making sure it looked real. I nodded and thanked him, tucked the rosemary into my basket, and walked away before he could ask what time they were arriving. I didn't have the heart to tell him that they hadn't shown up last year, or the year before that. I didn't want to admit that I was buying rosemary for ghosts. Back at the house, the preparations became a fever dream of hope. I polished the silver until my reflection stared back at me, distorted and pale. I laid out the embroidered cloth napkins, the ones with the delicate lace edges that my mother had saved for Sundays. I wrote out the place cards in my best cursive, the way I used to write their names on school lunches. Ethan, Hannah, Vivian. Seeing their names on the table made them feel present, as if the ink itself could summon them through the front door. By noon, the house was a symphony of scents. The cinnamon roast was browning in the oven, its savory richness mingling with the tart, sugary fragrance of a sweet cranberry pie cooling on the windowsill. I lit a vanilla candle in the bathroom, a scent Hannah used to tease me about. "It's so quaint, Mom," she'd say with that half-smile that never quite reached her eyes. I didn't mind the teasing. I just wanted the house to smell like the home they remembered, or perhaps the home I wished they remembered. The dining table was a masterpiece. 6 chairs, though only 3 were expected. My wedding china, thin and translucent as eggshells, sat atop the lace runner. I checked the family group chat. The screen was a blank white void. I took a photo of the table, the sunlight hitting the crystal glasses just right, and sent it. "Can't wait to see you all. Dinner's at 6. Love you. See you by 3? I stared at those blue check marks, waiting for them to turn into words. I waited while the shadows grew long across the hardwood floors. I waited while the radio hummed with soft jazz, the notes drifting through the empty rooms like dust motes. I put on my blue cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, and pinned on the gold brooch Jim had given me for our very last anniversary. I wanted to look like the mother they could be proud of. I wanted to look like someone worth visiting. But as the clock ticked past 4, then 5, the anticipation began to curdle into a familiar, hollow ache. The roast was done. I turned the oven to low, the heat clicking in the quiet kitchen. I sat by the front window, watching the street. A car turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the dusk, and for a heartbeat, my breath caught in my throat. But the car didn't slow down. It passed my driveway and pulled into the neighbors, the sound of muffled laughter drifting out as a door opened and shut. 6 o'clock came. The jazz on the radio shifted to a song from my 20s, something about missing chances and the bitterness of time. I didn't turn it off. I stayed in my chair, the pearl buttons of my cardigan cold against my skin. At 7, I finally stood up. My knees creaked, a sharp protest against the stillness. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I simply walked to the table, took the place cards I had written so carefully, and turned them face down. The feast was ready, The house was perfect, and for the 10th year in a row, I was the only guest at my own birthday party. The night was long, a slow passage of hours where the only company I had was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I didn't sleep in my bed. I sat in the kitchen, the light from the open refrigerator casting a clinical blue glow across the floor as I packed the untouched food into plastic containers. The cinnamon roast, once a centerpiece of celebration, now felt like a heavy burden. I handled the Tupperware with a robotic precision, my mind numb, my movements practiced. I told myself they were just busy. I told myself that perhaps a car had broken down or a child had fallen ill, and they simply hadn't found the time to call. These were the lies I had used to build a fortress around my heart for years. The next morning, the sun rose with an indifferent brightness. I woke up in my armchair, the blue cardigan wrinkled, the pearl brooch heavy against my chest. My first instinct, born of a decade of habit, was to check my phone. I hoped for an apology, a frantic message explaining a missed alarm or a forgotten schedule. Instead, I found a notification from Facebook, a memory from a friend's feed, or perhaps an algorithm sensing my loneliness. I tapped the screen. The image that flickered to life didn't just hurt. It shattered the very foundation of my denial. There they were, Ethan, Hannah, and my little Vivian. They weren't at a hospital. They weren't stranded on the side of a road. They were at a garden party, their faces lit by string lights and the glow of expensive cocktails. In the center of the frame was Linda, their father's second wife, the woman who had entered their lives long after they were grown, yet somehow occupied the space I had carved out with 30 years of sacrifice. They were laughing. Hannah was leaning her head on Linda's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy she hadn't shown me in years. Ethan was holding a glass high, toasted to something or someone else. The caption read, "Celebrating the best mom we could ask for. Happy birthday, Linda." The date on the post was yesterday, my birthday. They hadn't forgotten the date. They had simply remapped it. They hadn't missed dinner. They had chosen a different table. A coldness, deeper than the October frost, settled into my marrow. I looked at the photo until my eyes burned. I looked at Vivian, wearing a dress I had bought her for her school recital, a dress she told me she lost. She was smiling, holding Linda's hand. For years, I had been the one waiting by the window, the one sending the checks, the one keeping the memories alive like a flickering candle in a windstorm. And in a single digital image, I realized that I was the only one holding the rope in this tug of war. They had let go a long time ago. My thumb hovered over the screen. The family group chat, the one where I sent photos of pies and updates on my garden, the one that remained a graveyard of seen messages and silence, was still there. With 2 clicks, I did what I should have done 5 years ago. I deleted the chat. I didn't leave a parting word. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply erased the bridge they had stopped crossing. The silence of the house pressed heavier then. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of an empty tomb. I stood in the living room, bathed in the soft, gray light leaking through the curtains, and looked at the mahogany drawer in the hallway. That drawer held the yellow folder. Inside were the deeds to the house, the life insurance policies, and the 2 sealed envelopes containing checks that would have paid off Ethan's mortgage and Hannah's mounting debts. I had spent my life accumulating for them, thinking my value was tied to what I could leave behind. I walked past the drawer. I didn't open it. The air in the house felt stale, thick with the scent of a birthday that never happened. I needed air. I needed a voice that wasn't an echo of my own disappointment. I put on my old navy cardigan, the faded one I used to wear during my years at the library, and crossed the street to June's. June had been my neighbor for 40 years. She had seen my kids grow up. She had seen me bury Jim. And she had seen me sit on my porch every October 14th, waiting for cars that never turned the corner. She didn't ask if I had a good birthday. She didn't need to. She just opened her door, saw my face, and turned back toward the kitchen to put the kettle on. The smell of her house was a comfort, antiseptic, lemon, and a faint hint of Vicks Vapor Rub, a remnant of her decades as a floor nurse. She poured chamomile into 2 chipped mugs and set down a plate of lemon cookies. "You're done waiting for crumbs, aren't you, Marion?" she asked. She didn't look up from her tea. Her voice was blunt, the way only an old friend's can be. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I think I might be, June. I think I've finally run out of excuses for them. June looked at me over her bifocals, her eyes sharp and knowing. You raised them with books, Marion. You taught them how to read, how to dream, how to navigate the world. But you forgot one thing. They're only interested in reading their own chapters. They stopped looking at yours the moment you weren't the protagonist of their stories anymore. That sentence felt like a physical blow. It stuck with me as I walked back home. It echoed in my head as I sat at my computer. I opened my email and scrolled back to June, finding a message from months ago. It was a contact for a Mr. Tomlin. I hit reply. The subject line was short, professional, and final. Appointment request. I looked at the hallway drawer one last time. It no longer felt like a repository of dreams. It felt like a tombstone. I wasn't just changing a document. I was reclaiming a life. I had spent 70 years being a daughter, a wife, and a mother. I had been a provider, a ghost, and a disappointment. But as I watched the cursor blink on the screen, waiting for Mr. Tomlin's office to open, I realized for the first time that I was also a woman. And that woman was finally, mercifully, tired of being ignored. The walk to Mr. Tomlin's office was the longest journey of my life, though it only spanned 4 city blocks. The air was turning sharper, the kind of cold that bites at your knuckles and reminds you that winter is never as far away as you hope. I carried the yellow envelope tucked under my arm, pressing it against my ribs like a shield. Inside that envelope was the blueprint of my children's futures, the house they grew up in, the savings I had hoarded like a squirrel in winter, and the legal weight of my devotion. Every step I took felt like I was walking away from a version of myself that no longer existed. Mr. Tomlin's office was a relic of a different era, tucked above the old bakery on Main Street. To get there, you had to climb a flight of creaky wooden stairs that groaned under the weight of every secret brought to his door. The air inside the stairwell was thick with the scent of yeast and sugar from below, a cruel reminder of the birthday cake still sitting in my refrigerator at home. I reached the top, my breath a little short, and pushed open the heavy oak door. A small brass bell jingled, a lonely sound that cut through the muffled hum of the street below. The office was exactly as I remembered it from when Jim and I had first sat here 30 years ago. It smelled of old paper, peppermint candies, and the dust of 1,000 settled arguments. Law encyclopedias with cracked leather spines lined the walls, their gold lettering fading into the shadows. In the corner, a small American flag drooped beside a poster about elder trusts that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 90s. Mr. Tomlin stood up slowly as I entered. He was a man who moved with a patient, rhythmic grace, as if he knew that time was the one thing no lawyer could truly bill for. He buttoned his sweater vest over his white shirt and adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Ellis?" he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It's been a long time. I was sorry to hear about your birthday. Or rather, I was sorry I didn't see the usual celebration lights at your place." I nodded, my throat suddenly so tight I couldn't find my voice. I didn't want his pity, but the recognition of my solitude was a bitter pill. I walked to the chair opposite his desk, the same chair where I had once sat with Jim, holding hands as we planned for a future we thought our children would cherish. I laid the yellow envelope on the mahogany desk. It looked small and insignificant in the vast sea of his legal blotters. "That's the old one," I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "Read it if you must, to understand what was, and then I want you to shred it." Mr. Tomlin paused, his hand hovering over the envelope. He lifted his glasses to his forehead, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of doubt, a sign of a mother's momentary anger that would cool by morning. "Are you certain, Marion? This is a significant shift. We are talking about the entirety of your estate, the house, the liquid assets, the family legacy." "I have never been more certain of anything in my 70 years, I replied. He leafed through the pages anyway, his eyes scanning the lines of text that Jim and I had labored over. He was being respectful of the past I had just buried. I watched his face as he read the clauses that gave everything to Ethan and Hannah. He reached the end, looked at me once more, and then stood up. He walked to the corner of the room where a tall industrial shredder stood. The sound was sudden and jarring, a soft mechanical whir that grew into a low growl. I watched as the white pages disappeared into the narrow slot. I watched as the words bequeath, beloved, and heirs were sliced into 1,000 unrecognizable ribbons. It didn't look like legal documents anymore. It looked like confetti. It looked like the debris left behind after a parade has passed and the crowds have gone home. A strange sense of lightness washed over me. For years, those papers had been the only thing tethering me to children who didn't want to be held. Now, that cord was severed. "Now," I said, leaning forward as the shredder fell silent. "Let's write something new, something that matters." We spent the next hour drafting a document that felt like a rebirth. Every penny of my savings, the deed to the house on Maple Street, and even my modest collection of first edition books, the things I had curated over a lifetime of quiet reading, were to be redirected. I chose a local literacy fund that provided books to underprivileged neighborhoods, and a charity that offered scholarships and childcare for single mothers trying to return to school. These were women who were fighting for their lives, women who would understand the value of a hand reached out in the dark. I even added a specific note, one that made Mr. Tomlin pause his typing. I requested that my old library cardigan, the navy one with the frayed sleeves, be donated to the children's reading room at the local library. I wanted it to be there, a warm, soft presence for some child who needed a quiet place to disappear into a story. As the printer began to hum, spitting out the fresh, crisp pages of the new will, Mr. Tomlin looked up. The room was cast in the soft, gray light of a late October afternoon. "Are you sure you don't want to leave them anything, Marion? Not even a small gesture?" I thought of the Facebook photo. I thought of the empty chairs. I thought of the way they had looked at Linda, the woman who provided them with the status and the cool mother figure they craved, while I provided the foundation they took for granted. "I have already given them 30 years of my life," I said, standing up to sign the papers. "I have given them my youth, my worry, and my heart. If they haven't learned to value that by now, they won't value a house or a bank account. I'm not punishing them, Arthur. I'm simply giving my love to people who are actually looking for it." I signed my name at the bottom of the last page, Marion Ellis. The ink was dark and bold. That night, I returned to a house that was still quiet, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a blank slate. I went to the hallway closet and pulled out a shoebox labeled by year. It was filled with every birthday card I had received from them over the last 2 decades. I opened them one by one. Most were store-bought, the messages inside brief and hurried. "Happy birthday, Mom. Love, Ethan. Hope it's a good one. Hannah." I realized then that I had been keeping these cards as proof that I was loved, but looking at them now, they looked like receipts for a debt they felt they owed, rather than a gift they wanted to give. I took the stack to the kitchen, and one by one, I let them fall into the trash, except for one. It was a card from 5 years ago, covered in glitter and stickers that had begun to peel. Inside, in a shaky child scrawl, it said, "Happy birthday, Grandma. I love you big like the moon. Vivian." I set that one on the mantel. It was the only thing from the past I decided to keep. The rest of the house was silent, but for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel the need to turn on the radio to drown it out. I sat in the dark, watching the moon rise over the amber leaves, and for the first time since Jim died, I felt like I was finally home. The week that followed the meeting with Mr. Tomlin was the quietest I had ever known, yet it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before. It was a clean silence, like the air after a fever breaks. I spent my days moving through the house with a new kind of intentionality. I scrubbed the floors, not because I expected guests, but because I wanted to feel the solid wood beneath my hands. I baked bread because I liked the way the yeast filled the kitchen, not because I was hoping to fill someone else's stomach. I was learning to exist for myself, a skill I had neglected for nearly half a century. But peace, I've found, is often the prelude to a storm. The confrontation didn't happen because of a phone call or a sudden realization of their neglect. It happened because of Uncle Mark. Mark was Jim's younger brother, a man who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it, and who still shared a golf game with Mr. Tomlin's junior partner. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves $1 million estate and a mother who has finally found her spine. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of their arrival was sharp and aggressive, the roar of Ethan's expensive SUV pulling into the gravel driveway, followed by the rapid-fire clicking of Hannah's heels on the front porch. It wasn't the slow, hesitant pace of someone coming to apologize for a missed birthday. It was the frantic, entitled rhythm of someone who felt they were being robbed. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I saw their silhouettes. Hannah was standing rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ethan was pacing, his shoulders hunched in that way he did when he was about to lose his temper. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my hand resting on the frame of the mirror. I checked my reflection. I wasn't wearing the blue cardigan with the pearl buttons. I was wearing my old library navy, the one that smelled faintly of vanilla and old books. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a woman who had already made up her mind. I opened the door before they could knock. They didn't greet me with a hug. They didn't say, "Happy belated birthday." They pushed past the threshold like guests entering a stranger's home, their eyes immediately scanning the room, looking for signs of my supposed instability. They were looking for a reason to justify their anger, something to make my decision look like the rambling of an old woman who had lost her senses. "Mom," Hannah started, her voice already pitched at that jagged edge of a lecture. She didn't even sit down. She stood in the center of the living room, her designer handbag swinging from her arm like a weapon. "We heard from Uncle Mark. He said you went to see Tomlin. He said you changed everything." Ethan finally stopped pacing, leaning against the mahogany hutch where I kept the good crystal, the crystal I had once intended for his wedding. "Is this about the birthday, Mom? Really? You're punishing us for one missed night? Do you have any idea how busy we were? Linda had this whole event planned for weeks, and we thought you'd understand. You always understand." I didn't answer right away. I walked past them into the kitchen. I moved slowly, deliberately. I took 3 ceramic mugs from the cupboard and poured coffee I had brewed 10 minutes ago. I set 2 down on the kitchen table without a word. I kept mine in my hand, feeling the heat seep into my palms. "It's not one night, Ethan," I said, finally turning to face them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quietness of my tone seemed to unnerve them more than a scream would have. "It's a lifetime of nights. It's a decade of sitting at a table set for 5 while the food went cold and the sun went down. It's the silence that followed every check I sent, and the way my phone only rings when the mortgage is due or the credit cards are maxed out." Ethan scoffed, throwing his hands up in the air. "Come on, that's not fair. We have lives, Mom. We have careers and kids and things come up. You can't just cut your own children out because we didn't show up for a piece of cranberry pie." "No," I said, and this time I took a step toward him. "What's not fair is that I raised you to be strong, independent people, but I forgot to teach myself to be the same. What's not fair is that I allowed you to treat my love like a utility, something you only notice when the service is interrupted. You didn't miss a piece of pie, Ethan. You missed the woman who made it. Again." Hannah's face was flushed, a deep, angry red. "You're being dramatic. You've always been so sensitive about these things. We were going to call you this weekend. We were going to make it up to you. But this? Changing the will? Giving away our inheritance to people you don't even know? That's spiteful, Mom. It's beneath you." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the expensive highlights in her hair, the gold watch on her wrist, things bought with the loans I had never asked her to repay. I saw the entitlement in the set of her jaw. She didn't see a mother who was hurting. She saw a bank account that was closing its doors. Behind them, little Vivian peered around the corner of the hallway. She looked small and confused, her eyes darting between her mother's anger and my stillness. The pumpkin decorations I had hung for her weeks ago were still limp in the windows. The Halloween candy bowl was full and untouched, save for the lone butterscotch I had snuck in a moment of weakness. The season was moving forward, cold and indifferent, and for the first time, I was moving with it. "I'm not being spiteful, Hannah," I said softly. "I'm being honest. For the first time in 20 years, I am being completely, brutally honest with myself. And the truth is, I don't owe you a future that you've already decided I'm not a part of." The silence that followed was thick and jagged. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. They looked at each other, realizing for the first time that the old mom, the one who would always apologize for their mistakes, was gone. The air in the kitchen was stagnant, thick with the smell of bitter coffee and the electric charge of a family falling apart. Hannah's eyes darted around the room, finally landing on the mahogany drawer in the hallway, the one she knew held the legal documents of our lives. Her breath was coming in short, sharp hitches, the kind she used to have as a child when she didn't get her way, but now it was fueled by the cold calculation of an adult who realized her safety net had been shredded. "So that's it then?" Ethan's voice cut through the quiet, lower now, vibrating with a dangerous kind of edge. He stepped closer, invading my space, trying to use his height the way Jim used to when he was making a point. "You're just going to hand over our father's hard work to some strangers? To a literacy fund? Do you have any idea how much debt I'm carrying for the firm, Mom? I was counting on that house. We were both counting on it." I took a slow sip of my coffee, the liquid cooling but still strong. I didn't flinch. "Your father's hard work was meant to build a legacy of care, Ethan, not a subsidy for a life you can't afford. He didn't work those double shifts so you could ignore his widow while you spent her birthday celebrating another woman." "Don't you dare bring Linda into this," Hannah snapped, her finger trembling as she pointed toward the door. "She's been there for us. She listens. She doesn't make us feel guilty every time we walk through the door." "She doesn't make you feel guilty because she doesn't require anything of you," I replied, my voice gaining a clarity that surprised even me. "It's easy to be the favorite when you have no history together. I am the one who holds the memories of your fevers, your failures, and your first steps. I am the one who kept this house standing so you'd always have a place to come home to. But I've realized something. You don't want a home. You want an asset." Hannah let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "An asset? You're the one who's being transactional. You're literally putting a price tag on a birthday dinner. $1 million for a piece of roast beef? That's insane, Mom. You're not well. Maybe we should be talking about a competency hearing instead of a will." The threat hung in the air like a foul odor. It was the ultimate betrayal, the suggestion that my autonomy was a symptom of madness. For a second, my hand shook, the ceramic mug rattling against the saucer. But then I looked at Vivian. She was still standing in the shadows, her eyes wide, watching her mother and uncle treat her grandmother like a problem to be solved. "Is that where we are?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You'll try to prove I'm crazy because I've finally stopped being your doormat?" "We'll do what we have to do to protect our family's future," Ethan said, his voice turning cold and professional. "You're 70, Mom. You're alone in this big house. You're clearly not thinking straight. Changing a lifelong plan over a missed dinner? No judge in this county will think that's the act of a sound mind." I set my mug down on the counter with a deliberate clack. I walked to the hallway drawer, the one they had been staring at. I opened it. I didn't pull out the will. I pulled out a legal folder I had picked up from the courthouse the day after I saw the Facebook photo. It was a formal eviction notice and a revocation of the right to reside I had granted Ethan 3 years ago when his business hit a rough patch and he moved his home office into my guest wing and garage. I handed the paper to Ethan. He didn't take it at first, so I let it drop onto the table between our coffee mugs. "What is this?" he asked, though I could see the color draining from his face as he read the bold header. "It's your 30-day notice," I said. "I still legally own this house, every brick and every floorboard. Since you're so concerned about my mental health and my solitude, I've decided to simplify things. I'm selling the house. The proceeds will go to the Single Mothers Scholarship Fund I mentioned, which means you have 30 days to find a new place for your firm and your cars." The silence that followed was different from the others. This wasn't the silence of neglect. It was the silence of a total eclipse. Hannah looked at the paper, then at me, her mouth hanging open in a perfect O of shock. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. "You can't do that," Hannah whispered. "This is our childhood home. Our memories are here." "My memories are here too, Hannah," I said, moving toward the front door and holding it open. The wind caught the screen, making it groan on its hinges. "But I'm tired of living in a museum dedicated to people who never visit the exhibits. You have 30 days. I suggest you start packing tonight." Ethan's mouth opened, a torrent of protests ready to spill out, but the firmness in my eyes met the flicker of entitlement in his, and for the first time in his life, he saw that there was no room left for negotiation. I wasn't his sweet, quiet mom anymore. I was a woman who had seen the bottom of her own heart and found it was made of granite, not glass. The door didn't just close behind them. It seemed to seal the house shut, locking out the noise of their indignation and leaving me in a vacuum. I leaned my back against the heavy wood, listening to the crunch of gravel as Ethan's SUV roared out of the driveway, the sound of his frustration echoing off the neighbor's garage. For 30 years, I had lived for the sound of those tires arriving. Now, for the first time, I felt a profound sense of relief as they faded into the distance. I stayed there for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the late afternoon sun that filtered through the hallway. The house felt larger. It felt emptier, yes, but it also felt cleaner. The threat of the competency hearing was still ringing in my ears, a cold, sharp blade of a threat, but it didn't pierce me the way they thought it would. If anything, it confirmed that the people I had raised were strangers I no longer needed to please. By evening, the adrenaline had ebbed, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I walked through the rooms, looking at the assets Ethan had been so desperate to protect. I touched the mahogany hutch, the dining table where the lace napkins still sat, now crumpled and forgotten. I realized that for years I had been a curator of a museum that no one visited. Every object was tied to a memory of them: the dent in the baseboard where Hannah had crashed her tricycle, the height markings on the pantry door that stopped abruptly 5 years ago. I took a roll of blue painter's tape and a black marker from the junk drawer. I started in the living room. I placed a small blue square on the back of the crystal vase Jim had bought me in Prague, then another on the antique clock. I wasn't just marking furniture, I was untethering myself. Each piece of tape was a silent declaration: this does not own me. This is not my legacy. A soft knock at the back door startled me. I wasn't expecting them back. They were likely huddled in some sterile bar with Linda, plotting their legal counterattack. I walked to the kitchen and saw June standing on the porch, holding a Tupperware container and looking through the glass with that piercing, nurse-like gaze of hers. "I saw the dust cloud Ethan left behind," she said as I let her in. "I figured either the house was on fire or you'd finally told them the truth. I brought over some beef stew. Real food, not that birdseed salad you've been eating lately." She sat at the table, not waiting for an invitation, and watched me as I placed a piece of blue tape on the sugar bowl. "Tagging the spoils of war, are we?" "I'm selling it all, June," I said, sitting across from her. My hands were finally steady. The house, the furniture, the memories. I'm moving into that small apartment over by the library, the one with the big windows and the shared garden. June nodded slowly, spooning a bit of stew onto a plate. "It's about time. This house is too big for one woman and 1,000 ghosts. But you know they won't let go easy. Ethan's got that look in his eye, the same one his father had when a deal was going south. He thinks he can outlawyer you." "Let him try," I whispered. "I have 30 years of journals, June. 30 years of recorded dates where they didn't show up. 30 years of bank statements showing exactly where my loans went. If he wants to stand in front of a judge and talk about my mental state, I'll show that judge what a mother's competency looks like when she's been the only adult in the family for a decade." June reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her skin was like parchment, but her grip was like iron. "You're doing the hard thing, Marian. Most people die holding on to the rope, hoping the other side will eventually pull back. Letting go. That's the bravest thing I've seen in this neighborhood in a long time." We sat in the quiet kitchen, eating stew as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a presence, a solid, comforting thing. But as I looked toward the hallway, I saw a flash of white under the door. A letter had been slid through the mail slot. I stood up, my heart giving a small, rebellious thud. I picked it up. It wasn't a legal summons, not yet. It was a drawing on a piece of lined notebook paper. A yellow moon, a lopsided house, and a small stick figure with curly hair. At the bottom, in the same shaky scrawl I had seen on the card, it said, "Don't be sad, Grandma. I'll come back for the pumpkin cake." I felt a tear finally break, warm and stinging, as it ran down my cheek. Vivian, the only one who saw the woman behind the asset. I tucked the drawing into the pocket of my navy cardigan, right next to my heart. "What is it?" June asked from the table. "A reason to keep the lawyer's number," I said, looking out at the dark street. "And a reason to make sure that whatever I leave behind goes to the people who still know how to love without a contract." The battle wasn't over. In fact, I knew the next 30 days would be the most brutal of my life. But as I turned off the kitchen light, I didn't feel afraid. I felt like a woman who had finally found her way out of the woods. The following Monday, the first frost of the year silvered the lawn, turning the fallen amber leaves into fragile glass. Inside, the house felt like a command center. I had replaced the vanilla candles with the smell of floor wax and cardboard boxes. I was no longer a hostess, I was a liquidator. Every time I taped a box shut, it sounded like a gunshot in the quiet rooms, a sharp, rhythmic punctuation to the end of my old life. By noon, a black sedan I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. A man in a sharp, slate-gray suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. This wasn't Ethan. This was the opening salvo of the war they had promised. He introduced himself as a representative of a firm I'd never heard of, handing me a manila envelope with the practiced indifference of a process server. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, his voice as cold as the morning air. "Your children have filed for an emergency injunction regarding the sale of this property. They are also requesting a temporary guardianship over your financial affairs, citing concerning and erratic behavioral shifts. You'll find the court date for the preliminary hearing inside." I took the envelope. I didn't tremble. I didn't even look at the documents. I simply looked the man in the eye. "Tell my son that he's forgotten one thing. He learned his tactics from his father, but I'm the one who managed the books for 30 years while his father was out playing golf. I know where every ghost is buried in this family's finances. If he wants to open this door, he'd better be prepared for what walks out." The man blinked, surprised by the lack of fear in my voice, and retreated to his car. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Tomlin.
"Arthur," I said when he answered, "they've served the papers. They're going for my competency. I want to move up the estate sale. I want the house emptied by Friday. If they want to argue over my assets, let them argue over an empty shell." The rest of the week was a whirlwind of motion. I hired a professional estate liquidator, a woman named Sarah who looked at my house not as a home, but as a series of lots. We walked through the rooms I had scrubbed so carefully for 70 years. "The dining table?" she asked, her pen hovering over a clipboard. "Lot 14, I said. "Sell it. The chairs, too. All 6 of them. The mahogany hutch? Lot 22, and the crystal inside. Especially the crystal." As Sarah's team began to move the furniture, the house began to echo. It was a hollow, haunting sound, the sound of a life being dismantled piece by piece. I sat on a packing crate in the kitchen, watching as they wrapped my wedding china in gray newsprint. Each plate was a memory of a holiday dinner, a birthday, a Sunday brunch. As they disappeared into the boxes, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. For years, these objects had been anchors, keeping me tethered to a past that was no longer serving me. Now, they were just ceramic and glass. On Wednesday, Hannah appeared. She didn't come with a lawyer this time. She came alone, standing in the middle of the living room that was now half bare, her eyes wide as she saw the lot stickers on everything she had expected to inherit. "You're really doing it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're selling the piano? I practiced on that for 10 years, Mom. You promised it would go to Vivian." I looked at the upright piano, the wood scarred from years of use. "I did promise that, Hannah. I also promised myself a family that would show up for my 70th birthday. Promises are a two-way street. If you want the piano for Vivian, you can bid on it at the auction on Saturday. The proceeds go to the Literacy Fund. It's a tax-deductible donation." "You've become so cold," she spat, her grief turning back into the familiar armor of anger. "You're acting like we're enemies." "No, Hannah," I said, standing up from my crate. "I'm acting like a woman who is finally charging market value for her heart. You've had a free ride for 30 years. The promotion is over." When she left, she slammed the door so hard the remaining pictures on the wall rattled. I went back to my packing. I found a small box in the back of the linen closet. Inside was the blue cardigan with the pearl buttons, the one I had worn while I waited for them on my birthday. I looked at it for a long moment, feeling the softness of the wool. Then I placed it in the box labeled Charity Donation, Children's Reading Room. That night, I slept on a mattress on the floor of my empty bedroom. The house was a skeleton of its former self. There were no curtains to block out the moonlight, so the room was bathed in a pale, silver glow. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't listening for the sound of a car. I was just Marion. I pulled Vivian's drawing from my pocket, the one with the yellow moon and the lopsided house. I realized then that I wasn't just destroying a will. I was clearing the ground. You can't build something new until the old, rotting structure is cleared away. And as I drifted off to sleep, the only sound I heard was the wind whistling through the empty hallways, carrying away the last whispers of the woman I used to be. The courthouse was a building of cold marble and high ceilings, designed to make a person feel small. As I walked down the long corridor toward courtroom 4B, the click of my sensible shoes echoed like a ticking clock. I wasn't wearing the Navy Library cardigan today. I was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit I hadn't worn since Jim's funeral. I felt like a soldier returning to a battlefield I had already memorized. Ethan and Hannah were already there, sitting on a wooden bench outside the heavy double doors. They were flanked by a man in a pinstriped suit who looked like he'd never stepped foot in a kitchen or a grocery store. When they saw me, Ethan stood up, his jaw set in that arrogant line he'd inherited from his father. Hannah looked away, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a theatrical, concerned whisper. "It's not too late. We can go home. We can talk about this like a family. You don't have to put yourself through a hearing." I didn't stop walking. I didn't even slow down. "We aren't here to talk, Ethan. We're here to see who has the better memory." Inside, the courtroom was quiet, smelling of floor wax and old wood. Judge Miller was a woman in her 60s, with eyes that looked like they had seen every trick in the book. She looked at the petition for temporary guardianship, then at Ethan's lawyer, and finally at me. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, addressing Ethan's attorney, "you've filed an emergency motion claiming that Mrs. Marion Ellis is demonstrating a precipitous decline in cognitive function and financial responsibility. Your evidence?" Sterling stood up, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, my clients report that their mother, a woman who has been a stable pillar of the community for decades, suddenly and without provocation, decided to disinherit her entire family and liquidate all her assets, including the family home, following a single missed dinner. She is currently sleeping on a mattress on a bare floor and has donated her entire life savings to charities she has no prior history with. We believe she is being influenced by a neighbor or is suffering from a late-onset delusional break." The judge turned to me. I sat next to Mr. Tomlin, who remained perfectly still, a calm anchor in the room. "Mrs. Ellis, what do you have to say to these claims of sudden provocation?" I stood up. I didn't look at my children. I looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to present a piece of evidence. It's not a medical report. It's a ledger." Mr. Tomlin handed a thick leather-bound book to the bailiff. I had kept it in the bottom of my cedar chest for years. "In that book," I said, my voice steady and clear, "is a record of the last 10 years. Not of my health, but of my children's presence. I began keeping it after the first Thanksgiving they missed. It tracks every phone call made, not by them, but by me. It tracks the 3,650 days since Jim died. Out of those days, my son has visited me 12 times. My daughter has visited 9. Every visit was accompanied by a request for money. Checks I have documented in the back of that ledger, totaling over $400,000. The room went silent. I could hear Ethan's heavy breathing from the back of the room. "I also have a printout," I continued, "of a social media post from October 14th, my 70th birthday. While I was sitting in a house I had prepared for them, they were at a party for their stepmother, Linda. They didn't forget the date. They simply traded me in for a newer model. My decision to change my will wasn't a delusional break, Your Honor. It was a mathematical calculation. I realized I was funding a family that had already declared me dead. Why should I wait for the funeral to distribute my estate to people who will actually use it to change the world? Judge Miller leafed through the ledger, her face unreadable. She looked at the columns of dates, the notes I'd written in the margins. Waited until 10 p.m. No call. Sent Ethan $15K for office repairs. No thank you note. She looked up at Ethan and Hannah. Her gaze was like a physical weight. Mr. Sterling, cognitive decline usually involves a loss of memory. It appears your client's mother has a memory that is, if anything, too sharp for your client's comfort. She hasn't lost her mind. She's found her self-respect. But the house, Sterling stammered, the liquidation, is hers to do with as she pleases, the judge interrupted. Motion for guardianship is denied. Motion for injunction against the sale is denied. Mrs. Ellis, I suggest you find a very good moving company. This court is adjourned. As the gavel hit the wood, a sound like a thunderclap, I felt the final shackle break. I turned to walk out. Ethan was standing in the aisle, his face white with a mixture of shock and fury. You've ruined everything, he hissed. You're going to die alone in that little apartment, and no one is going to come. I stopped right in front of him. I reached out and adjusted his tie, the way I used to when he was a little boy. Ethan, I said softly, I've been alone for 10 years. The only difference now is that I'm no longer paying for the privilege, and as for dying alone, I'd rather be alone in a room I chose than alone at a table you refused to sit at. I walked past him and out into the crisp October air. The sun was shining, and for the first time in a decade, the future didn't look like a long gray hallway. It looked like an open road. The day the auction ended was the day the house finally surrendered. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a shell of lath, plaster, and hollow spaces. The movers had been efficient, carrying out the heavy mahogany hutch, the dining table with its 6 ghosts, and the piano that had once echoed with the discordant notes of childhood lessons. All that remained were the dust outlines on the floorboards, pale ghosts of a life I had finally decided to outgrow. I walked through the rooms one last time, my footsteps sounding like drum beats in the emptiness. Without the rugs and the curtains, the acoustics of the house were sharp and unforgiving. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to ask, "Where is everyone?" But I didn't feel the need to answer. I felt a strange, shimmering clarity. I had survived the court hearing, the betrayal, and the realization that my children's love had a price tag I was no longer willing to pay. As I reached the kitchen, the sunlight was pouring through the unadorned windows, casting long geometric shadows across the linoleum. I sat down on my last remaining suitcase. The house was cold. I had turned the thermostat down to 55. There was no sense in heating a memory. I was waiting for the locksmith to arrive and change the bolts before I handed the keys over to the new owners, a young couple who were moving in with a newborn and a sense of hope I hadn't felt in this zip code for years. A soft, hesitant knock at the front door broke the silence. It wasn't the aggressive pound of Ethan or the sharp rap of Hannah. It was a light, fluttering sound. I opened the door to find Vivian standing on the porch. She was alone. Her mother's SUV was idling at the curb, a dark, impatient shape in the driveway, but Vivian had walked up the stairs herself. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat that made her look like a splash of paint against the gray October sky. In her hands, she held a small, crumpled paper bag. "Grandma," she whispered, her eyes darting past me into the cavernous hallway. "Mom said you're going away." I crouched down, ignoring the protest of my 70-year-old knees. I took her small, cold hands in mine. "I'm not going far, Vivi. I'm just moving to a place that's a little easier to clean, a place with more books and less dust." She looked at the empty hallway, her lip trembling. "But the pumpkin cake? And the stickers? You're not taking the stickers?" "The stickers stay in my heart," I said, my voice thick with the only emotion I hadn't been able to shred. "And as for the cake, I saved you something." I reached into the pocket of my navy cardigan and pulled out the small butterscotch candy I had been saving. It wasn't $1 million inheritance, and it wasn't a deed to a house, but as her face lit up, I realized it was the only thing in this entire ordeal that was actually real. She took the candy and then handed me the paper bag she was carrying. "I made this for your new house," she said. I opened the bag. Inside was a small, hand-painted rock. It was lumpy and covered in too much glitter, but across the middle she had painted a single, shaky word: home. "Thank you, Vivi," I whispered, pulling her into a hug. She smelled like laundry detergent and rain. For a moment, the bitterness of the last month vanished. I knew she was being used as a pawn by Hannah, a final attempt to pull at my heartstrings, but in this moment, the connection was pure. She was the only one who didn't want anything from me but my time. "Vivian, let's go, now!" Hannah's voice shrieked from the driveway, sharp and discordant, cutting through the moment like a blade. Vivian pulled away, looking fearful. She gave me one last quick squeeze and ran down the stairs, her yellow raincoat fluttering in the wind. I watched her climb into the back of the SUV. I saw Hannah's silhouette in the driver's seat, rigid, never once looking toward the house, never once acknowledging the mother she had tried to declare incompetent. The car sped away, leaving nothing but the smell of exhaust and a swirling vortex of dead leaves. I stood on the porch until the sound of the engine was gone. I looked down at the glittery rock in my hand. The locksmith arrived 5 minutes later. He was a young man, perhaps the same age Ethan was when he stopped calling. He worked quickly, the metallic snip-snip of the tumblers falling into place signaling the finality of the day. When he handed me the new set of keys, bright, shiny, and unburdened by history, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was freedom. I walked to my car, the small suitcase in one hand and Vivian's rock in the other. I didn't look back at the windows. I didn't look back at the garden where I had spent 70 years waiting for things to bloom. I started the engine and turned on the radio. A jazz station was playing something upbeat, something with a tempo that matched the rhythm of my heart. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw Mr. Doyle from the farmer's market walking his dog. He waved. I waved back. A real wave, a genuine smile. I wasn't the poor widow anymore. I wasn't the lonely birthday lady. I was a woman with a small apartment, a large mission, and a brand new chapter that hadn't been written yet. The house was behind me. The debt was settled. The promises were shredded. And for the first time in 70 years, the road ahead of me belonged to nobody but Marian Ellis. The apartment on 2nd Street was small, scarcely larger than the master bedroom of the house I had left behind, but it was filled with a light that the old house had never known. It was the light of a room that held no secrets and harbored no ghosts. My bookshelves were the first things I unpacked, the spines of my favorite novels standing like old friends against the clean white walls. I placed Vivian's glittery rock on the windowsill, right where the morning sun would catch the sparkles and remind me that love, in its purest form, is never actually lost. A month had passed since the keys to the Maple Street house were turned over. In that time, the silence had changed. It was no longer a hollow space waiting to be filled by the voices of ungrateful children. It was a peaceful sanctuary where I could hear my own thoughts. I spent my mornings at the local library, volunteering in the very children's reading room where my navy cardigan now lived. I saw it occasionally, draped over the back of a rocking chair, a soft, familiar blue that comforted children as they tumbled into the worlds of Charlotte's Web or The Secret Garden. One rainy Tuesday, a letter arrived. It wasn't a legal summons, and it wasn't a bill. It was from the Literacy Fund. Attached to the letter was a photograph of a young woman named Elena. She was holding a toddler in one arm and a nursing degree in the other. The letter explained that because of the endowment I had created, Elena had been able to pay for her final semester of school and secure childcare. She wrote, "You didn't just give me money. You gave me a life where my daughter will never have to see me give up. Thank you for believing in a stranger." I sat at my small kitchen table, the smell of fresh chamomile tea rising from a mug that didn't belong to a set of 12. I looked at Elena's face. She didn't know me. She didn't know about the cinnamon roast or the empty chairs on my 70th birthday. She didn't know about the court hearing or the ledger of lost years. To her, I wasn't a bank account or a competency hearing. I was a catalyst. I was a bridge. My children had stopped calling altogether. I heard through June that Ethan had moved into a smaller office and that Hannah was telling anyone who would listen that I had lost my grip on reality. But their words no longer reached me. They were like the dry leaves I used to rake, brittle, dead things that the wind eventually carried away. I had spent 70 years building a kingdom for them, only to realize that they never wanted the kingdom. They only wanted the gold in the treasury. By giving it away, I had finally made myself invisible to their greed, and in that invisibility, I had found my soul. I picked up my pen and began to write. Not a will, not a ledger, and not a check. I began to write a story, the story of a woman who woke up at 70 and realized that the happily ever after wasn't something you waited for others to provide. It was something you carved out of the remains of a broken heart. The October air was crisp outside my window, but inside it was warm. The radio played a soft melody, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't listening for the phone to ring. I was listening to the sound of my own breath, steady and sure. I had $1 million for my kids, but I chose myself instead. And as I looked at the calendar, the date October 14th was no longer circled in red. It was just another day in a life that finally belonged to me. I whispered to the quiet room, not with sadness, but with a profound, resonant peace. "Happy birthday, Marion. You finally made it home.